UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your hosts, Dr. Dean Bertram and Jenn Durrell.
Well, hey there, baby. I'm looking forward to tonight because we just get to chat, which is wonderful. Our guest, Gemma Jade, unfortunately had to cancel because there's a health issue within her family. So we hope everybody is doing okay there, and we will have her hopefully on sometime in the next year, because at the moment we're booked out for about 2 months, I think.
Yeah. Which is
We've got a lot of great guests coming up, actually. Over the course of I should have had the list in front of me, but I certainly know some of them off the top of my head. I know that we have, just maybe start with our special Christmas show. We have Heidi Erickson back, who is always a blast to do the actual Christmas show. I'm not sure what type of tales Heidi will be regaling us with, but I'm sure there'll be some dark Christmas ghost stories, which used to be the tradition of maybe Krampus, but remember, it used to be part of the tradition of Christmas in countries like the UK, or, for example, Dickens' A Christmas Carol is a ghost story, but it's because people used to tell ghost stories at Christmas. It's not something we really do very much anymore. But it'll be a fun show. I know Greg Bishop's coming up as well. I think Greg's in January sometime, right?
Yeah, Bob Davis is next week, isn't he?
Bob Davis is next week. He'll be great as well. Who else is coming up? I'll just throw out a few other names.
We have Sam. He rescheduled.
Sam Baltrusis, because we had that was when you had the COVID, and my old MacBook died like a couple of hours before showtime, so you couldn't do it. I was going to fly that ship solo. But we're not going to be talking about the Fae like we had planned tonight. I don't like, for some reason, I dislike Fae. The term, I mean, not the entities. I don't know why. It just seems to be so popular now. The term Fae.
Well, what would you prefer then?
I don't know. She, the good neighbors, the other folk.
Not everybody would call them good neighbors.
Well, I'm just saying. I don't know. I don't think I ever had a problem with Fae until every second, paranormal mention of the other folk was the Fae, the Fae, the Fae. It just became, I don't know, seemed to be overdone or something. It might just be.
I thought fairy was overdone.
Hey, you should. Well, you know why? I think you're not meant to say fairy because they don't like fairy. Exactly. Apparently. But who knows? But of course, fairy's derivative of the fair folk. That's where it comes from.
We have comments. I wasn't even paying attention.
Oh, excellent. You might want to run that ticker tape as well in the bottom.
Oh, yeah.
Mr. Schultz, hello to the third baby. We have to have you back soon too, Ed, to talk about your new book, which would be great. It's funny, just before the show, Jen and I were talking about hypnosis or hypno-regression, past life hypno-regression, and I was thinking of Ed, how he'd be the person to normally talk about that, because I'm quite suspicious of hypnosis used in paranormal adventures. Hello, Ken. Thank you for listening. I hope everything's good in Michigan. Are you guys snowed under like we are here in Wisconsin? I believe in the fair folk too, Ed, or I think there's something there. I know that's a funny Peter Pan reference, though. I do believe in fairies. I do. Get a little Tinkerbell back to life. But we were buried in snow here. We had, it must have been a foot overnight, I would say. My snowblower died. I have, as you know, I'm on a rural property. I have a long driveway, and it just gave in the ghost after one pass of the drive. We're just going down the driveway and a little bit up. I normally have to do that, half a dozen times. And then so I shoveled my way out today, which took hours, and then I got the snow machine working again, the snowblower working, after I'd done all that digging, after I'd spent like 2 to 3 hours shoveling. Anyway, I'm sure people don't want to hear about my shoveling tales, but I mean, talking about weather, that's something I know you wanted to touch on a little bit tonight, the terrible tragedies down south of me and to the north of you.
We've had some crazy weather. I mean, Missouri, we've had a very mild, it's not even winter yet, but usually we have some type of snow by November. Even sometimes we'd have snow in around Halloween, but we haven't had anything, and it's been warm. And yesterday it was warm and humid and rainy, and I didn't realize there were storms south of us till this morning when I found out that there was a tornado that stretched through several states and hit Kentucky and Illinois pretty hard. And I think part of Arkansas too, because I think there was a nursing home in Arkansas, an Amazon manufacturing warehouse in Illinois, and then a whole town in Kentucky.
Well, I mean, I was unaware of it until you mentioned it to me today. I've been totally out of the news loop. But my prayers will be going out to all those people hit by that tragedy when I dropped to my knees and prayed tonight. But I just hope any of our listeners from that part of the world are okay. Just terrible. I mean, I hadn't seen the footage because I hardly watch any news these days. I mean, I don't trust it, and B,
well, I have a little bit of footage I could show that
yeah, you can. Why don't you play some in the background while we're talking about it, just for a minute or something, in case there's other news oblivious people out there like me? Because I was shocked when you showed me that. It looked like a war zone. It was worse than I even imagined. But
okay, so it should be. Oh, it is playing. So this is the town, Maysville. Is that what it said? Maysfield?
Yeah, something like that. See, like I said, I'm out of the news loop at the moment, but it's just terrible. I mean, I would think I was looking at the third world or a battle zone or something. It's difficult to imagine that damage in the US. So here I was complaining about the snow removal I had to do. I mean, jeez.
Well, I think there's like 80 people so far, at least in that town, that they're still searching for people.
It's some harsh weather. Well, I sure hope all those people are found. Though, I mean, obviously, there's many that have probably passed. I hope some are found. I hope some are still okay. They're under the rubble and they dig them out or something. But yeah, just not good at all. 100 people, lost their life there. Good grief.
Yeah, the number's probably been up since the last time I looked at it.
Just terrible. Just terrible.
It's 3 o'clock in the morning too, so most people are sleeping in their bed.
Well, that's the thing. You wouldn't even know when it hit. I mean, it looks like just whole houses have just been blown away, and it's.
Looks like certain portions, because there's more of the town and it's up.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, not good at all.
It's very scary. We
certainly live in strange weather times. Our snow this year is much heavier than it was last year. Although I've been here when there's been early heavy snows in the past in Wisconsin, but nothing like the suffering these people have had to undergo.
It makes me think of Joplin. Of course, I think Joplin, I believe, was a bigger and more widespread damage than this one. But it makes me think of it. Do you remember the Joplin one?
Oh, I'm vaguely aware of it. Yeah, I don't know if
I don't think you were living here yet.
No, I wasn't. I heard of it, but I wasn't here at the time. That's right.
Yeah.
No, it certainly puts things into perspective when you see the type of damage that can just fall on you when you least expect it. Goodness gracious. Well, on cheerier notes, what were we talking about before? We were talking about your current interest in past life regression reincarnation. You showed me some clips before the show.
Well, no, I find it very interesting. I'm always looking it up, and I put it in YouTube just to see what I could find, and I found that there was an old show. I think it said 2014, so it's really not that old. But it was on Lifetime, and they only had 3 episodes. But they were really cool, and I can show one if you want.
No, we can just talk. We can just talk about it.
Okay.
I think. Unless, did you want to know if we need to. You can show a bit of one if you want to. But I'm I'm obviously suspicious of hypnosis
Of it?
used. Well, I'm suspicious of. I think hypnosis is a worthwhile therapeutic tool, and I think
Mhm.
it can do all kinds of interesting things. But to recover fantastic memories or fantastical memories, I think it's problematic. And there's been certainly plenty of academic work that's talked about how if the therapist has an expectation and particularly if the patient has an expectation as well,
Mhm.
you're going to have what you expect you're going to have when you go in. In fact, I'm rereading the very first alien abduction book I ever read, which was Edith Fiore's Encounters, which I think
Mhm.
came out. I read that before I read Whitley Strieber's Communion or any of Bud Hopkins' work. And I think Edith Fiore's Encounters came out, I don't know, a couple of years probably after Communion, like it was still in the 80s. But for some reason, I read that before I found Strieber's work. And I remember at the time it having a really profound impact on me because I didn't know very much about the abduction phenomenon. It was still fairly early before it had become, massively popularized as well in that period in the late 80s, early 90s. It was emergent, but there hadn't been the X-Files or there hadn't been
Mhm.
quite as much in your face. The little gray alien motif, which we're all used to now, wasn't a cultural meme or a cultural simulacra kind of back there. It wasn't in your face all the time. And I remember reading that when I was in my, I don't know, 20s, I guess, and thinking, good grief, this might really be going on because it was quite convincing. And here was this woman who was a mental health professional talking about how she had discovered these abduction experiences in her patients. And
Mhm.
she talked about what the signs might be that you're an abductee. And it was things like if you ever have dreams about UFOs, or maybe just reading this book will bring back a memory, or all things which could quite easily be triggered. Maybe you get nervous when you read an abduction story, or you feel uncomfortable when you read one. And at the time, I don't think I approached it as critically, obviously, as I do now. I kind of took it at its face value, as people
Mhm.
tend to do, and thought there are people being abducted. And the worst part about it is that when I read it, I did remember a dream I had, which I've talked about on the show before, repeatedly when
Mhm.
I was young, about who I thought of as a little man coming at night and taking me away. Now, he
Mhm.
didn't look anything like a gray alien. He looked far more like almost like a malevolent midget from Wizard of Oz or something, but stocky. I remember him being about my height, and I don't know what I was, 5'6", 7", somewhere in that range, probably.
Mhm.
Maybe a little younger, a little older, but somewhere in that 5 to 8 range, I guess. Maybe 4 to 8, actually, somewhere in there. And he used to, he was stocky, and he'd come and he'd take me away to this very strange place where there are other weird beings. And I won't go into the whole story, not just for time restraints,
Well,
but
that's the Fae, right?
well, I don't know well, that's the thing. I don't know if it was the Fae or if I think myself that I was probably working something out in my psyche as a young boy. And I don't necessarily think that it was had a reality beyond my own subconscious mind or dream
Mhm.
state. That said, my memories of that are as real ontologically as my memories, other memories of the time. Like I remember the last time that little man came, I thought I'd never come back. I had this feeling if I go with him tonight, I'm never going to come back. And I
Mhm.
remember wrestling in my bed, which sounds silly because I was this little boy, but I remember actually fighting with this little midget man, my
Mhm.
own my own size, and somehow overcoming. Like he couldn't get me to go with him, and it was it. And it's the last time he ever came. That's why I think it might have been something playing out my psyche. But I remember that as physically as I remember wrestling with boys at school or in the playground when I was that age. Like it's a very real physical memory to me.
Mhm.
Now that might just be because when we're younger, and I certainly do know this is something I think which is fairly well accepted in the mental health realms, is that children's fantasy state is much more developed, and they often almost exist in a semi-hypnotic state. They're very susceptible to fantasy ideas and to dreams and to imaginary friends and to games being much realer than they are when we're an adult. You only have to watch kids play and they can go into this wonderful imaginary land, which you and I couldn't just all of a sudden, imagine we were pirates sailing the seven
Mhm.
seas, or we had a pet dragon or whatever. They find it very easy to imagine. So maybe it's just that as a child, the fantasy world feels as real as the physical world. Anyway, back to Edith Fiore's book. So at the time, that really, really bothered me when I read that book. And it probably is what in many ways helped reignite my interest in UFOs, because I was interested as a little kid. I was a kid of the 70s. So I grew up with Close Encounters and David Bowie Starman songs and, you know, what was the Styx, Come Sail Away with Me. There were a bunch of them, Carpenters, Calling Occupants of Interplanetary Craft. Anyway, that it was front and center, In Search of, Eric von Daniken, Chariots of the Gods books. ET stuff was everywhere, as the whole New Age was in the 70s. It is again, really. But so as a kid, I couldn't. Ed Schultz says our kids are in alpha most of the time. So yeah, that's kind of what I was talking about. This is what we should talk about this when you're on next, Ed. But anyway, back to the Edith Fiore book and alien abductions, is that myself having that dream kind of memory, reading the book, like I'm sure I hadn't forgotten it, but it wasn't something I'd spent a whole lot of time thinking about till I read that book. And that's probably what re-triggered my real interest in UFOs. And then I just devoured alien abduction stuff. And it's not that I ever thought I was necessarily an abductee, but I thought maybe I am. And the more I read, the more skeptical I became. And certainly rereading that book today, as somebody who's probably spent a solid decade of his life doing very little work-wise, but studying UFO belief, which is what I did when I was doing my master's and PhD, and ever since then has had some level of interest in it. And before then I had some level of interest. So 20 years of my life I've spent probably consuming this kind of stuff to varying degrees. When I reread the Edith Fiore book now, I'm reading and I'm going, it's quite clear what was happening here. She talks about how she read Donald Kehoe's book when she was a teenager or something, his first book, the guy who wrote, what was his first book? It was, is it Flying Saucers Are Real? Is that what his first book was? Anyway, he's the guy who found a NICAP, the Marine, I think he was a major, right? Kehoe. And anyway, he was the main UFO, I don't know, writer, probably in that period. There were others, but Kehoe probably stands above. Anyway, she read his book and devoured it in one sitting when a family friend gave it to her. And then she believed from reading that book that ETs were visiting. So she always believed it. And then when she started hypnotizing people and doing hypnoregression, she said, my patients were surprised to learn that they'd been abducted. They didn't even have any suspicion going into her. I guess they went in for other things. She said most of them didn't even know or have any idea they'd been abducted. And I'm thinking, okay, so a woman who admits she believes ETs are here and contacting us, herself who says how much she wanted a contact and how she used to spend time, Kehoe, Donald Kehoe, Ed Schultz right there. But she spent so much of her time obviously interested in this. And then when she's in a clinical position, her patients start finding they've been abducted. And this is something Ed Schultz would, I'm sure, be able to give us his point on as well. But I'm assuming if a mental health professional who is using hypnosis on somebody believes in the abduction phenomenon, it doesn't take very many leading questions when you've got somebody in that state to start recalling an abduction scenario. And as I've talked about before, when I did my PhD research work and talked to a number of abductees, one of the abductees I talked to and interviewed at length had experiences with probably the country's best known hypnoregressionist. I know there's probably a few of them people can think of. I won't say his name, but he'd written multiple books on the topic, and she had never been out. She knew something had happened to her, something fantastical and weird and strange, but she could never remember what the entities were like she interacted with. Zero recollection. And even under hypnosis, she could never remember. And she said, but he pushed and he pushed and he pushed, and I knew what he wanted to hear. And eventually I told him what he wanted to hear, little gray men with big heads and big black eyes. So you've got to wonder how often that takes place in alien abduction phenomena. Now, when we move over to past life regressions, I have another, and this is all anecdotal stories, but when I was doing my research here in various UFO groups and whatever else back in the late 90s for my PhD dissertation on UFO belief, I was at a UFO conference, I think it was in Clearwater, and there was another relatively well-known abduction regressionist and past lives regressionist person there who you could go and you could do a session with for, I don't know, $100 or something. And I was talking to somebody before they did, went and did the session. I think they were a vendor there. I was chatting to them a little bit. And when they came back, they said, oh, it was amazing. She made me remember this future encounter I had with extraterrestrials. And she was having, and I'm saying, wait, a future encounter? Oh, yeah. She was, and I'm thinking, and the guy was sincere. I have no doubt. Maybe the abduction regressionist, past life regressionist was sincere, but that somehow the laws of physics and time and everything else, and they don't apply, I guess, in the mind, but that he was able to interact with the aliens and ask them questions like she was asking and doing things. And it just seemed to me to be, this is all some weird confabulation. And how much of past life regression therapy and alien abduction therapy is this confabulation between the hypnotist or the hypnotherapist and the abductee or past life rememberer. I would suspect that there's an awful amount of people building stories with each other when somebody's laying on the couch. So,
well, you shouldn't trust every hypnosis either. So, or hypnotist. I mean,
I don't trust any of them. No, I mean, don't get me wrong. I trust somebody if you go in and, like, say Ed, and you go in and you want to quit smoking or something. I think that's because the power of the mind's an incredible thing. But I don't trust anybody who says they can make me remember an alien abduction.
Well, I wouldn't go to anybody who would want to make me remember something that I don't want to remember, even if it did freaking happen. So
exactly.
I don't know. No, I was supposed to do stuff like that when I was younger because I had other things happen to me when I was younger, and I was supposed to go through this regression therapy. And I even talked to several psychiatrists, and they're like, "Oh, well, you'll just come," and then, like, no, I'm not going to show up there unless my mom's in the room and there's somebody recording me, so I know you're not putting shit in my head. And they wouldn't do it. So I'm like, nope, not going to do it.
There's actually, that reminds me of another book or two I wrote back when I was researching this type of stuff that I read about the unreliability of things like satanic ritual abuse memories as well. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure some of those kind of things do go on, but I also know that there's been tragic accounts where people who were innocent were accused after somebody with no memory of any satanic ritual abuse ended up with a therapist who had that as their agenda. There's a story. In fact, they made a movie out of it. And when I was watching the movie, I'd read the book about it years before. And I went, oh, that's what this is based on. The movie has, oh, what's his name? It's escaped me now. He's a guy from Before Sunset and Before Sunrise and Waking Life. Do you know that big 90s actor? Oh gosh, what's his name? Anyway, if anybody out there can remember, put it on the screen. Anyway, but he essentially, I think he plays a detective or something in the movie. And a daughter's come forward and accused her father of not just interfering with her, but being part of a big satanic conspiracy, and they're doing rituals to her since she's been a child. And then the other sisters, I think, or maybe other family members come on board and start believing her. And the father himself, at least this is now my memories shifting between the movie and the actual book I've read. But I know in the real story this is based on, the father himself started saying, I have no memory of doing any of this, but if my daughter says I did it, I must have been part of this satanic conspiracy, and somehow they've made me forget. So he confessed, even though he said, I can never remember doing it, but she would never lie. And finally, it all came out. It was all just this therapist who had like some weird belief system agenda. It was all just total BS. Now, again, I'm sure some of this stuff. Well, that's interesting. It says he worked in a church that had a history of satanic abuse. And again, I'm not saying these things don't go on, because I'm sure these things do sometimes go on. I'm sure there is ritual abuse, but also the problem is when the memories are recovered under hypnosis, that's when it becomes problematic. Ken asked, what do I think of the Betty and Barney Hill case? I'm glad you asked. I find that I find the Betty and Barney Hill case absolutely fascinating. I think most of our readers probably know the story, but Betty and Barney Hill were a mixed race couple who were were driving home from holiday. And where were they? They were like driving down through somewhere out east. I should know this. I've read Fuller's Interrupted Journey and hundreds of other, well, not hundreds, but exaggerate, dozens of other things. Anyway, they were driving back somewhere out east, and they start to notice this light in the sky follow them. They eventually pull over, and Barney, the husband, grabs a pair of binoculars and gets out of the car, and he sees this craft and supposedly what look like little figures on the other side looking at him, and they speed away, and that's about all they can remember. Anyway, they start having dreams, or Betty first starts having dreams about being taken on board a ship by a little man, and then Barney supposedly has dreams as well, although supposedly he had his eyes closed. I think one of the stories goes throughout the whole process, so he doesn't remember as much as Betty does of the experience. But the basic story they told was they went around a corner, and I think that an alien craft or a UFO flying saucer landed in the middle of the highway, and little men came out. They were paralyzed, and they took them onto the ship, and they were both examined, and Betty was examined gynecologically. And I think originally it wasn't talked about, but Barney was meant to have had something placed over his groin, and semen was extracted, and this all came out under hypnosis. And I think, like I said, Betty was having some troubling dreams. Now, of course, when two people are very close to each other, there's a psychological process called a folie à deux. It means if one person has a bizarre folly fantasy, then it's very easy to infect the person you're close to with it. So the fact that Betty was the first person to start remembering this stuff, and then Barney kind of followed, was it definitely a folie à deux? I don't know, but it certainly plays like a folie à deux. When you read Fuller's Interrupted Journey, which has a lot of the transcripts of the actual the hypnotic sessions that Betty and Barney went under, there are some very interesting details which don't match up to modern abduction law at all. For starters, when Barney remembers seeing them at first, I think looking through the windows of the ship, he remembers it under hypnosis. I don't think he ever remembered that consciously. Or maybe when they land in front of him as well, that the ETs are wearing like black leather jackets and black biker hats.
Okay.
There are no grey ETs wearing black leather jackets and black biker hats. Barney describes them a number of weird different ways. He describes them as they look like Nazis. They look like red-headed Irishmen. They have big noses like Jimmy Durante. Betty, interestingly, describes them looking like Mongoloid children because she worked, I think, with Mongoloid children. The gynecological procedure that Betty underwent as the first real modern abductee, and now has become par for the course of every second woman who remembers being abducted, maybe almost every woman who remembers being abducted, not every, but the majority, this kind of gynecological process. Betty and Barney were unable to have children, and she'd had, I think, gynecological trauma, and she would have been to a gynecologist many times, and I'm sure would have undergone all kinds of uncomfortable procedures. So this would have been something front and center in Betty's subconscious, at least. I think in the story as well, Betty and Barney, when they stopped at a diner, not that long before they saw the craft, there was some young hoods, at the time, some young, biker type guys, I think, wearing leather jackets that Barney felt intimidated by. Rightfully so, perhaps, because back then a black man and a white woman weren't something that you regularly saw in America. And there was this sense of kind of, I think, pre-existent dread there of maybe being under threat, even though I don't think they did anything. I think Barney was just concerned. And then it's interesting, the aliens were wearing black leather jackets and biker hats. Not that unlike the people he'd seen earlier. So there seemed to be all these different weird confabulations playing perhaps between Betty and Barney, and perhaps between the therapist. And the other thing, of course, this is something I don't know if anybody ever has written this, but it's something I can't believe hasn't been written, because it seems to me very strange and quite poetic. And that is, the first abductee couple, the first modern alien abduction. There were other ones, the Villa-Boas case, for example, but it's very different. And there's other other strange things like abduction cases, obviously going back to fairy faith, like we were talking about before. And in most mythologies, there's people being taken by the gods or by something non-human. And subjected to some type of sexual interaction. But it's interesting that a childless couple who were black and white spawned essentially the gray extraterrestrial myth, right? I mean, there is obviously something at some very strange, sophisticated psychological level, I think, happening there. Because what do grays look like? They look like young stunted children, right? They look like children. Greys are these small, weird little looking creatures, and
depends who you talk to.
well, no, I mean that's the most common version, right, of the alien abductee and all the creatures that
I don't think they're always considered small. They're just really skinny.
There's talls in the Streba thing, but generally speaking, if you ask somebody to just today, if you looked at your average movie or South Park rendition or X-Files episode, these creatures are what? They're child size and they're grey. And grey is obviously halfway between black and white. And so the first abductees were a black and white woman, a black man and a white woman who couldn't have children. And they essentially spawned the grey, diminutive, childlike ETs. So that's my kind of very brief and very strange take, Ken, on the alien abduction.
Well, you remember in the movie, not
Kick
the movie.
Yeah,
I guess it was the movie, Communion. Remember he dealt with the tall, thin ones, which I believe he probably used the word grays. I'm not sure. And then he had those little blue short little fuckers that would show up in his room.
Yeah, but
those you've heard about too.
Yeah, but you're right, and that's in the book and in the film. But Streba is also, that is not the stock standard alien abduction account, right? I mean, either that you hear.
Well, I've heard of the little.
I've heard of ones where there's praying mantis creatures or a reptilian in the corner or a blonde extraterrestrial watching. So there's all kinds of different.
Love and saucers. Sorry, you said the blonde.
I haven't seen that movie, but I need to. But
you need to.
But I'm certainly aware. Even in the Travis Walton abduction story, when he's on the craft, he bumps into those Aryan type or Nordic or Venusian type, whatever you want to call them in ET lore, pretty blonde, Germanic, I guess, looking extraterrestrials. But so my point is that the Streba one with those weird little blue munchkin things with hoods aren't in your standard abduction tale, and they're not the standard trope. The standard trope is the grey ET somewhere around, I guess, 4 feet tall, right? So I always found it interesting that it was a black and white couple that were the first abductees who were childless. It almost seems like there's some mythological resonance from that, and that just be me being playing silly academic games, but something's going on. And maybe it's our reality bleeding into a more sophisticated poetic reality. I don't even know.
Yeah. Well, I think grays is just the term, because I've heard of other people mentioning different colors, but they just term it the grays. Like why am I forgetting the name? The tall whites.
Yeah, but they're not gray. See, they're the tall whites, and that's the invention.
But the same facial features, though.
No, they have horse-like heads. The tall whites.
They did?
I read Hill's, or is it Hall? Charles Hall, is that his name?
Yeah.
I read his book when it first came out towards the end of my dissertation. I've seen this doco. I haven't read. I don't know if I read the first two or just the first one. I can't even remember now. I think he's written about, is it 2 or 3 or 4 books he's written now? I don't even know. But yeah, I think they've got more horsish heads. They don't look like the grey ETs, if I recall. But no, the grey ETs are for the most part grey. I'm sure, because this is all interconnecting with our imagination. I'm sure people imagine red ones and green ones and white ones and blue ones and black ones and purple ones. But for the most part, the stock standard archetype is the grey, actually being grey in color, extraterrestrial. Now, does that mean that's what they all are? I don't even know. I'm not even sure if they're all independent of us or not anyway. Like the more you look at, I think the more you look at reports, and hypnosis is, of course, as we just said, something else altogether, because who knows how much the imagination plays, there. But even when people have conscious recollection of events, I think it's difficult to say that our subconscious isn't playing some type of game there as well, or interacting with something, or that itself isn't drawing on our culture or our subconscious. Because think of the change in extraterrestrials over the course of the last 70 years. Like, nobody's seeing Hopkinsville goblins anymore, unless you look at the Newkirk story in Hellier. But for the most part, Hopkinsville goblins aren't popping up. Flatwoods monsters aren't popping up. ETs that look like they're wrapped in aluminum foil aren't popping up. You know what I mean? There
Well,
isn't.
no, it's changed now.
People who are robot creatures and big ball, old Jetson era kind of, space bubble helmets. That's my point. It's changed.
Yeah.
But
Well,
did all of a sudden the ETs change who were coming here? Like, okay, did the Greys move in like circa 1980 and kick all the other ETs out, or most of them out?
Yeah.
Like, obviously it's interacting with us on some level.
I don't think it's all fixated on the beings anymore. Everything's fixated on the lights and the strange phenomena that's happening. And
it's gone full circle, really.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because there seems to be, well, there doesn't seem to be, there's this resurgence in interest in flying saucers. There's this resurgence in interest in flying saucers or UFOs now because of the Tic Tac video and all that Nimitz fleet footage. And now there's, I think we said we were going to talk about some news on the show today, and I just pulled up this thing from military.com. Pentagon UFO rapid response teams ordered up by Congress. This is from, I think, 7th of December, so a few days ago now. But teams of Pentagon and intelligence community experts would rapidly respond to military UFO sightings and conduct field investigations under newly unveiled defense legislation set to pass Congress. And it goes on, but you almost can't open a news site these days, and not see some reference to the whole UAP thing playing out. And it isn't really any different to earlier interests in the flying saucer phenomenon, going back to who we were talking about, Donald Kehoe, back in the day. Back then, they weren't talking about little aliens either. In fact, Kehoe would refuse to even investigate. His organization, NICAP, would refuse to investigate initially any stories that had anything resembling an encounter with the pilot of a flying saucer or an occupant of a flying saucer, because in the 1950s, most of the people who were coming out and trying to get publicity about their contacts with extraterrestrials were the contactees, which had this quasi-religious feel to it, like George Adamski talking to beautiful Venusians who came delivering spiritual type messages, along with most of the other contactees were coming forward with similar encounters. So they were dismissed by the more serious UFO researchers and investigative groups as just nonsense. And as a result, they wouldn't look at anything with ETs, with actual like ET or pilots of the sources. It changed a little bit. I think that the landing in Socorro, the Lonnie Zamora case, where the deputy Lonnie Zamora saw two little figures parked next to a egg-shaped craft run back in and take off in the desert outside of Socorro, New Mexico. I think that started to be taken seriously. And then, ironically, we were talking about the Hill abduction report. I think that was one of the first accounts of that type, i.e. people actually saying they had essentially physical contact with ETs that NICAP took seriously. Before that, none of that stuff was taken seriously. So yeah, we've come full circle. Now it's all about, again, it's just like back in the 50s. Oh, a military fighter pilot saw a UFO. Those were the type of stories which were big news back then. And now we have the leaked video footage. Although I think we tend to lump phenomena together which mightn't be the same phenomenon. Like, I see no reason to think that the video leaked and now acknowledged by the Navy and the Department of Defense of the Tic Tacs or those strange craft moving around have anything to do with the Betty and Barney Hill abduction, or anything to do with the law of extraterrestrials interacting with people throughout UFO belief. I mean, there's no reason that those craft aren't our own sophisticated craft, aren't something from the Soviet Union or China. I tend to think they're our own. I think this idea, when people come forward and say, well, I'm a military pilot and I know we don't have anything like that, they wouldn't know you don't have anything like that. Look at was it Ben Rich, the guy who was, I think, the head of Skunk Works, said, if you can think about it, we've probably made it. If you've seen on Star Wars or Star Trek, we've played around with that kind of stuff. The technology that it has been accessed, I think, by a black budget of billions and billions of dollars, it's beyond anything that your average pilot has ever seen or flown. So for somebody to come out and say, well, I'm a pilot and I know that doesn't exist, or even to have one component of the Defense Department say, we don't know what it is, like for the Navy to say, well, it's not ours, doesn't mean somebody over here isn't doing it. But we tend to go, well, if there's a video of a strange craft, then all those other ET stories must be true. It's not necessarily the same phenomenon. Like the abduction phenomenon, whatever it is, probably has nothing to do with those videos. You know, the abduction phenomenon we probably should be looking at differently. If it's a real phenomenon, we should be looking at fairy faith and other traditions which have parallels. But instead, when I say we, I'm being disingenuous because I don't consider myself part of that at all. When I say we, I'm talking about UFO believers. UFO believers tend to say, oh, well, it doesn't have anything to do with fairies. Or if it does, oh, those people back then didn't know what they were interacting with. They were really extraterrestrials and they just thought they were fairies, those stupid people. We know what they are. And they want to look at all the phenomena which fits their pattern together. So we'll take the UAPs from here, we'll take this abduction story from here, we'll take this story from some 90-year-old who remembers a crash supposedly in the New Mexico desert, and we'll put all this together to create this bigger mythology. Well, perhaps maybe they should be going, well, we'll look at UAPs as maybe being the type of stuff they were probably playing with, like Ben Rich was talking out of Skunk Works, and maybe we'll look at the abduction phenomenon as some richer mythological interaction that we've always had with something else, which goes through all the different religions and spiritual traditions. So I often think things get grouped incorrectly.
Yeah, I could.
I know you're probably more open to the actual ET idea than I am, I think.
I'm not necessarily open. Like the more and more I read and learn about things, I think it could possibly be that a lot of things are meshed together and they're actually kind of elementals in a way, but that's another completely different subject. But
well, elementals, I don't know. That's another one of those
nature spirits, but still, I don't know if you read more about elementals.
I just wonder if it's one of these new age things which gets thrown around to try to make sense of something as well, or to try to classify something. We do. I mean, I do it too. We all do it. We all do this kind of classification where we want to put these things in this box because it makes sense, and these things in this box because it makes sense.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I don't know whether they're extraterrestrial or whether they're elementals or whether they're demons or what they are. I mean, I have my
you would like to think they're demons.
Well, I think probably a lot of it is. I think that it's ironic that modern UFO believers tend to dismiss, not necessarily they'll either won't see the comparison. Like I spoke to Bud Hopkins when I was doing my PhD research at a conference, and I said, what about people, for those who don't know who Bud Hopkins is, I'm assuming everybody does, he was one of the main UFO abduction regressionists and authors who popularized the modern alien abduction type narrative. He wrote Intruders and he wrote Missing Time, and those titles suggest the type of what he was talking about. But he thought they were physical ETs here, part of some kind of breeding program. And when I spent some time with him, I think I had breakfast with him at Fort Fest back in 1999, Maryland, where I also met John Keel, which is it was an entirely different experience, and they were both good experiences. I'm glad I met both of them, spent time with both of them. But when I was talking to Hopkins, I said, what about these parallels that a lot of, because I was there as a PhD researcher, so I wasn't trying to push my own ideas. I was just curious to see what people were believing at the millennium, really, or the turn of the century. And so I asked him, I said, what do you think of those people who suggest there's parallels between older mythological and fairy type traditions with modern UFO abduction law? And he said, there's no comparison. There's no pot of golds at the end of the alien abduction story. And I'm thinking, and I didn't say anything because I'm there to hear people's ideas. I'm not there to argue with them or to put my point forward. Certainly back then I wasn't. And I'm thinking, it was just an incredibly, I don't want to say ignorant, but just an incredibly dismissive thing to suggest. There's hardly any pot of golds in 99.999% of fairy faith stories either. Just because there's a leprechaun idea that there's a pot of gold at the end of it. I've got multiple books on fairy lore. You'd be hard pressed to find pot of gold written in any of them. But it was just a dismissive way to say, to get rid of any parallels. And there are clear, and there are many academics, and from Jacques Vallée through people who've written PhD dissertations on it, have looked at the commonalities between abduction law and fairy faith. And also people like Joshua Kuchin does an amazing job, who's been one of our guests at that type of stuff. So to just dismiss it out of hand is silly. And a lot of, I think, people who believe in the physical reality of extraterrestrial abductions have done that. Or alternatively, they've gone, well, those people were really encountering ETs back then and they dismissed them as fairies. But here's my point. And back to you making the point about I'd like them to be demons, or I'd like to think they were demons, is I find it interesting that we live in this, for the most part, disenchanted world. Like, we don't have a whole lot of contact with the supernatural anymore, or other than the occasional alien abductee or person who's, I don't know, doing ghost hunting or something. The Christian church, for example, very rarely talks about a legitimate unseen world. That's why I was recently reading Michael Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm. And it's just fantastic because it talks about how, when you look at the Bible, how important this other spiritual realm was and its interactions with us, of all this almost pantheon of beings, of course, with Yahweh or God at the top of it. But I find it ironic that in those times in the past where people believed in the unseen realm or the fairies or whatever, and seemed to have interactions with these things quite often, that now we go from a culture that hardly has any interaction with the other. We go, oh, they didn't know what they were encountering. They were really encountering ETs. They just didn't know it was ETs. Well, maybe the ETs were lying to those people, because there's a lot of people back then who had actual genuine communications with the divine or the fair folk, or whatever we want to call them. There's a far more records back then which seem to have more of an actual, I don't know, make more cultural sense to me than a lot of the ET stories today, where until there was the gray extraterrestrial leveling field we talked about, where it became standard, there was no cohesive idea of what we were experiencing. So I find it weird that we dismiss a time when people seem to have a better idea about the other than we do today. And those people didn't know what they were talking about. We know they're extraterrestrials. So when you say I would like it to be demons, I'm certainly cognizant of the fact that a lot of these things, to me, seem to fit patterns of older religious and spiritual and mythological traditions. And to think of them as extraterrestrials just because that's how they either manifest to us, or how we believe, or what we believe they are. Because don't forget too, a lot of this is somebody just seeing a light in the sky that moves erratically and them going, that must be an extraterrestrial craft. Well, people have seen weird lights in the skies since time immemorial.
I'll change my battery. Go ahead.
My point is just, when you say I would like them to be something else, it's not that I would like them to be, it's that I'm actually, if there's a physical reality, and I'm not even sure if there is to a lot of this stuff, I don't fall into the camp which assumes that it's all some space age technology that we're dealing with. It seems to be something linked with us on a far deeper level than aliens visiting from the planet Zeta Reticula. That looks so 80s. That's great. And I saw your ponytail when you spun around, and the colors had changed, and it looked like I was in an 80s party or something.
Yeah, it's very orange. It takes my camera a while to like adjust to all the different non-lights. So
Anyway, that was my rant. You should rant a little bit now.
I guess I missed some of it. I had to take my headphones
Oh,
off.
you heard all of it. I was just at the end, just continuing it while you were setting up the camera.
Oh, okay. Well, it'll take it a minute to.
And you know,
I'm going to be orange probably the rest
position.
of
Oh well. Or maybe that's enough about the ETs and the Fae.
ETs and the Fae.
Yeah. What else did you want to touch on?
Oh, wait a minute. Ed responded down here. I just didn't see it.
Social activism has collapsed spirituality, I think, in the church in a very big way. Unfortunately, I think that we have become disconnected from any type of spiritual reality, which was the whole purpose, I would think, of worshipping or of, trying to think on or think about the divine.
I'm still orange.
I like all your little Christmas gnomes in the background behind your I Want to Believe poster. My daughter is obsessed with gnomes at the moment because she's into Squishmallow gnomes. You got her into Squishmallows originally. I think you bought her like a Squishmallow.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was Josie. Josie's the one that brought it over,
right.
and then they fought over how cute they were. Remember?
And then you bought.
So we had to get
my daughter one. That's true.
Well, we had one, so there wasn't any fighting over toys.
But now she has Squishmallow gnomes. Like she's got a couple.
Yeah,
of
I
them.
know.
She
They're
wants more
cute.
for Christmas.
I didn't even know they had gnomes till she showed me that one.
So I see gnomes all the time. So to see them on your wall there, it's funny as well. See, that's part of that tradition that comes down to us now, and it's kind of Disneyfied in a way. It's safe and cuddly for little kids to have a gnome doll or a cute little gnome Christmas ornament. But that's all part of what we're talking about as well. And there was, of course, periods where that was taken very seriously. The other folk or the good neighbors.
Oh, well, yeah.
And today, I think in places in Ireland and places in Scandinavia and Iceland, yeah, they still take these things seriously.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
There is something nice about the belief system. And C.S. Lewis, in the last book he wrote, was released posthumously. And I talk about his nonfiction here. I'm not talking about the Narnia books or anything, but it was a book called The Discarded Image. And it was basically about how medieval Europe used to have a very ordered sense of, reality and what our role in the cosmos was. And one of the chapters is just dedicated to what's the word for them? It means the long-lived ones. It's the things which aren't really angels or demons. They're something else, and they're essentially the fair folk. And there's this idea that, he has different ideas. That's why he had them in their one chapter. I think he has ideas that, he talks about the different ideas. Like maybe they're the spirits of the dead, some people would suggest, or maybe they were fallen angels who weren't, fully evil, so they didn't fall far enough, or they didn't take a side in the war in heaven, or there was all these different interpretations of what they might have been. They were another whole race of beings, but they've always been a part of European culture, and of course non-European cultures have similar ideas and similar beliefs as well. My mother just sent me a Facebook message saying, do you remember the story of Dunderklumpen in Scandinavia, or Dunderklumpen? When I was a little boy, Dunderklumpen was quite popular. I think there was a cartoon that was released, and I think it was about I don't remember it entirely, but I do remember, I think it was some gnome-type man from that part of the world. Yeah.
I'll have to Google it.
I think it's worth reading children fairy tales too. Like I'm homeschooling my daughter, and we recently completed I've had this, it's like the Harvard Classics, which was considered the shelf of books where it was all the great books, just like that, which I have. I also have Britannica's Great Books of the Western World, but they had children editions, which I bought for my daughter, and the children's shelf of book, the Junior Classics, has all of the stories which kids probably used to have read to them all the time. So the first volume, which we just finished, we read about, I don't know, 10 pages of them a day. And now we're into stories of, I think, wonder and magic or something. But the first one was fairy tales and fables. So it had various Grimm stories in it, the Brothers Grimm stories in it. It might have had some Anderson ones in it. It had ones from Russia and ones from Scandinavia and different stories from all over Europe. And not all of those stories are, happy little ending Disneyfied type tales, but I think our culture was richer when children had those stories as their bedtime stories than some just totally vapid child's book that you pick up today. Like I see very few modern children's books which I think are worth a damn, to be honest. There'll be no longevity to them. Nobody's going to be remembering them in 100 years.
Like which books?
No, that's what I'm saying. None. Now, I think there are some books from probably the late 19th, early to mid 20th century, which will hang around for a long time, like Wind in the Willows, Winnie the Pooh, probably some of the Dr. Seuss books. There are books in that period which I think will have legs, but I don't see it, obviously, because I have a child, and I don't buy her many of those modern just stupid books, but other people do. And when I look at them, there's just, there's nothing of any worth in them. And I'm not saying that every story in a Grimm's Brothers collection is a moral story or a wholesome story, but there's something intrinsic about human nature or an animal nature sometimes, and the world in those stories. And sometimes there's brutal. There's this wonderful story, which is both in that book we just finished and also in our full Brothers Grimm collection. And I think it's just called The Cat and the Mouse or something.
Yeah.
It's about this cat and a mouse who have a deal that they're keeping the cream for the winter time, right? But the cat keeps making excuses and goes away each day and eats the cream or the fat or whatever they've stored.
Mm-hmm.
And in the end, the mouse finds out the cat had been cheating him and eating all the cream. And so what happens? Does the cat get his comeuppance? No. You know what happens? The cat eats the mouse, and the finishing line of the story is, and that's the way of the world. So there's no necessarily great modern, moral for the story. Ken says J.K. Rowling. Maybe Rowling will be around, but I think I was specifically talking more about actual ones aimed particularly at children. And I don't know whether I haven't read any of the J.K. Rowling books. I certainly want to, now that she's been, essentially kicked off having anything to do with Harry Potter, even though she created it, because she might have done a tweet or two which was decided by the woke crowd to be politically untenable. Now I want to read J.K. Rowling. But certainly from the movies I saw, I never saw the kind of substance in those that would have been in a C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien book. They did touch a nerve, though. They certainly had a big impact on younger readers. And maybe when my daughter gets to that age, that'll be something she'll discover. But I'm more talking about, Ken, the type of books that you read, to a 5-year-old, perhaps. Although I am reading more advanced books into a 5-year-old because we're reading, I think in a couple of volumes we'll be doing the kids' stripped down version of the Iliad and the Odyssey and those kind of books, because that's the stuff kids used to have read to them. They didn't have all this vapid, non-offensive material which is made today to just, I don't know, teach them how to be good woke little citizens or whatever. It's just, there's nothing in these books of any nothing to offend anybody. There's no power in them. There's no potency. There's nothing. Doesn't mean occasionally there isn't a cute book with nice illustrations, but anyway, that's my rant on childhood and children's books. And by the way, when I was a kid, I was, like I said, I was a kid of the 70s. So I was raised on, I had UFO books and monster books and ghost books. But I also had all of that kind of Hans Christian Andersen and Brothers Grimm stuff was still part of our culture. Brer Rabbit, the Uncle Remus stories. I have the complete Uncle Remus here, and I was reading it to my daughter this summer. It was Ed Schultz, regular guest, just brought up Brer Rabbit. And of course, I don't even know if that would be allowed to be on shelves anymore in school libraries, because it's written in the language of the African American member of, I think it's meant to be post-slavery, but I think he's still kind of, somebody who, works on the plantation or something. So it's written in the phonetic way that somebody who might have been in that station in the 1920s or turn of the century actually spoke. So I'm not sure if, cancel culture. I mean, I could be wrong. I don't know if Uncle Remus has been removed from library shelves, but I bet you there are some libraries that have removed Uncle Remus. And that's hilarious as well. Chloe used to laugh when I read that, because you've got to read it in that broad Southern African-American dialect, because it's the way it's written. And, Brer Rabbit is always tricking Brer Fox, or Brer Fox is getting revenge on Brer Rabbit. And it's just all these, again, that books like that, forget the candidates you have to read it in. The content of that stuff had never been a child's book today. It's hilarious. Like Brer Rabbit tricking all the other animals to build him a house, or Brer Rabbit nailing Brer Fox's tail to the roof so he can go and steal Brer Fox's lunch. It's just these things which, I don't know, childhood used to be more fun. On that cheery note, we've done our hour. I don't know if there's anything else.
We have done our hour.
We've
just been kind of rambling through stuff.
I think that last 20 minutes, I don't even know if we were talking about the paranormal.
I don't think so. We're talking about books. What else were we talking about?
Well, we were
everything's
talking about
just
UFOs and fey stuff. But then again, talking about Grimm Brothers fairy tales is, I guess, part of the broader tradition of the fair folk and things, because those things are in there. That's all part of it.
I grew up on Dr. Seuss, so that was my favorite. Everything Dr. Seuss.
Yeah, I don't know if I had. I know I had Winnie the Pooh. I had Winnie the Pooh.
My dad was a librarian, so he really liked Dr. Seuss. So he would always read me their books.
Did you read all the ones which have been cancelled? Aren't there like half a dozen of them?
Oh, I have them. Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, it's unfortunate.
If you're offended, we'll get rid of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's plenty of stuff I don't like. I would never want to ban it, but. And again, I actually believe in the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and I believe that it's to defend unpopular speech. And I believe the quote, which I think it's actually, I don't think Voltaire actually, maybe Voltaire did say it. I don't know. It's said Voltaire said it though. Although I disagree with what you say, I will defend to the death your right to say it. That's what free speech is meant to be. It's meant to be, listen, I don't like what you're saying, but you get to say it because everybody gets to speak. There we go. We should talking free speech instead of talking weird.
Oh gosh.
Well, it was a fun show anyway. Thank you for listening, those of you who did. Hopefully we'll have Jem and Jade back in the new year sometime. And we have Bob Davis next week, which will be a fascinating show. And I hope everybody's getting ready for Christmas, and stay with us through December.
Yes.
Join us for the Christmas show of Talking Weird. That's on Christmas night itself. It's on the 25th, right?
Yeah. Most people aren't doing a Christmas show.
We're doing a Christmas show.
Yep.
Okay. Well, until next time, everybody, keep it weird.
Keep it weird.
Thank you for joining us tonight. If you're interested in checking out more episodes, you can find us at talkingweird.com. If you haven't already, please like the show on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Talking Weird Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to Talking Weird. We're available on most podcast platforms and YouTube. And if you do enjoy the show, please leave us a review. Dean and I would really appreciate it. Until then, stay safe and keep it